If you've ever had a plant decline for no obvious reason, you're not alone. Most gardeners have experienced it. The soil seems moist. The plant gets sunlight. You're following the usual advice. Yet growth slows down, leaves begin to suffer, and eventually the plant starts looking worse instead of better. That's one reason hydrogen peroxide has become a quiet tool in so many gardeners' routines. Not because it's a miracle product, and not because it replaces good gardening practices, but because it can help address several hidden conditions that often develop before gardeners notice there's a problem. Over the years, gardeners have used hydrogen peroxide for everything from seed preparation to root zone management and disease prevention. The surprising part is that many people know the product without fully understanding where its biggest advantages actually come from. In this video, we'll look at 9 overlooked things about hydrogen peroxide that can help you make better decisions in the garden, avoid common mistakes, and recognize problems earlier. And we'll start with one of the most misunderstood factors affecting plant health: oxygen around the roots. Number 9. Hidden root oxygen advantage. Most gardeners pay attention to 3 things when a plant starts struggling: water, sunlight, and fertilizer. If the leaves look tired, the natural reaction is to focus on one of those 3. What often gets overlooked is something happening below the surface. Roots don't just need moisture, they also need oxygen. That sounds obvious when you hear it, but many gardening problems begin because the soil stays wet long enough that oxygen becomes limited around the root zone. The plant may still be sitting in damp soil, yet the roots are no longer operating under ideal conditions. This is one reason hydrogen peroxide gets so much attention among experienced gardeners. When hydrogen peroxide breaks down, it releases oxygen as part of the process. That's why you sometimes see bubbling when it comes into contact with organic material. The interesting part isn't the bubbles themselves. It's what they reveal about what's happening around the roots. Now, that doesn't mean hydrogen peroxide replaces healthy soil, proper drainage, or good watering habits. It doesn't. But in situations where roots have been sitting in overly wet conditions, some gardeners use hydrogen peroxide as a way to support the root zone while they correct the underlying problem. The important decision shift here is this: if a plant looks stressed, don't automatically assume it needs more water. Sometimes the better question is whether the roots are getting enough oxygen. That small change in thinking can completely alter how you respond to plant stress. And once you understand that root health starts before you ever see symptoms above ground, another question naturally follows. If hydrogen peroxide can influence what happens around roots, what happens before those roots even exist? Number 8. Seed germination. Acceleration. Every gardener has experienced it. You plant a tray of seeds, a few sprout quickly, a few take forever, some never emerge at all. The easy assumption is that the seeds were poor quality. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes the story begins before germination ever starts. Certain seeds carry surface contamination or natural barriers that can interfere with ideal sprouting conditions. That's one reason some gardeners use hydrogen peroxide during seed preparation. The goal isn't to force seeds to grow, the goal is to create cleaner starting conditions. What's interesting is that this benefit arrives before the plant even appears above the soil. Most gardening products are used after a problem becomes visible. Hydrogen peroxide can sometimes be part of the preparation stage instead. That's a very different way of thinking. Instead of asking, "How do I fix a weak seedling?" the question becomes, "How do I give the seed a better start?" That shift may not sound dramatic, but over time it changes how gardeners approach success. Strong starts often lead to stronger plants, fewer setbacks, and less frustration later in the season. Of course, hydrogen peroxide isn't a guarantee. Different seeds respond differently, and good germination still depends on temperature, moisture, and growing conditions. But it highlights a larger pattern. Many gardening victories happen before you ever see visible growth. And that brings us to one of the most important hidden problems in the entire garden. A problem that usually starts long before most gardeners realize it's happening. Number 7. Why root rot starts earlier than most gardeners think. Few gardening problems are more frustrating than watching a healthy-looking plant suddenly begin to decline. Leaves yellow, growth slows. The plant seems to lose energy. By the time those symptoms appear, many gardeners assume the problem just started. In reality, root rot often begins much earlier. That's what makes it so dangerous. The visible symptoms are usually late arrivals. The actual process may have been developing for days or even weeks beneath the soil surface. Persistent moisture creates conditions where roots remain under stress. As those conditions continue, the root system becomes increasingly vulnerable. Eventually, the plant can no longer support healthy growth above ground. The mistake many gardeners make is waiting for obvious symptoms before taking the situation seriously. By then, valuable time may already be gone. This is where hydrogen peroxide becomes part of a prevention mindset rather than a rescue mindset. Experienced gardeners often pay attention to the conditions that create root problems instead of focusing only on the damage those problems eventually cause. That's a completely different decision process. Rather than asking, "How do I save this plant?" they ask, "What warning signs am I missing?" That change in perspective is powerful because it moves gardening from reaction to prevention. And once you start thinking that way, you begin noticing something else. Many issues that appear to be disease problems may actually be warning signs of conditions that were building quietly long before anyone noticed them. Number 6. The fungus problem. Most gardeners misdiagnose. When gardeners spot mildew, mold, or fungal growth, the reaction is often immediate. Find a treatment, spray something, attack the fungus. But that's not always where the problem begins. Many fungal issues don't suddenly appear out of nowhere. They develop because conditions quietly favor them for days or weeks before symptoms become obvious. Poor airflow, excess moisture, organic debris, damp surfaces that stay wet longer than they should. The visible fungus is often the result, not the starting point. That's why experienced gardeners frequently focus on conditions before they focus on treatment. Hydrogen peroxide sometimes becomes useful in these situations because it can help reduce microbial buildup on affected surfaces. More importantly, it encourages gardeners to think about why the problem appeared in the first place. That's the decision shift. Not, "How do I kill this fungus?" but "What allowed this fungus to become successful?" If the underlying conditions remain unchanged, the problem often returns. The real advantage isn't simply reducing visible growth, it's learning to recognize the environment that allowed it to happen. And that environment often begins in a place many gardeners rarely inspect closely. Number 5. The soil surface mistake that encourages disease. Most people pay attention to leaves. That's understandable. Leaves are visible. The soil surface isn't. Yet some of the earliest warning signs of future problems appear right there. Fallen organic matter, excessive moisture, compacted surface conditions, and neglected debris can gradually create an environment where disease pressure increases. Nothing dramatic happens overnight. That's what makes it easy to miss. A garden can look healthy while small conditions quietly accumulate beneath the plant canopy. This is actually one of the places experienced gardeners quietly use hydrogen peroxide that newer gardeners often overlook. Most people think about treating a problem after they see damage on the plant. Experienced gardeners sometimes focus on the surface conditions that allow problems to develop in the first place. When organic debris, algae, slime, and excess moisture begin accumulating around the soil surface, hydrogen peroxide may help reduce some of that buildup before it contributes to larger issues. The hidden advantage isn't that peroxide magically fixes disease. The hidden advantage is that it gives gardeners another way to manage conditions before disease pressure gains momentum. That's a very different decision. One gardener waits for symptoms, the other watches for conditions. And by now, a larger pattern should be starting to emerge. Hydrogen peroxide keeps appearing in situations where the real advantage comes from noticing hidden conditions earlier. At this point, you may have noticed something unusual. None of these discoveries depend on hydrogen peroxide being a miracle product. What's interesting is that hydrogen peroxide keeps showing up in completely different parts of the garden. Seeds, roots, disease pressure, surface conditions. And yet the reason isn't always the same. Experienced gardeners often notice that peroxide becomes most useful when hidden conditions start developing before obvious symptoms appear. That's the pattern connecting everything we've covered so far. Hydrogen peroxide isn't appearing in these situations by accident. It's appearing because many of the problems gardeners struggle with begin long before visible damage arrives. And once you start looking at gardening through that lens, one of the biggest mistakes gardeners make becomes much easier to recognize. Number 4. The overwatering warning signal. Few gardening mistakes are more common than overwatering. Ironically, it often comes from good intentions. A plant looks stressed. Growth slows, leaves begin to droop. The natural response is to give the plant more water. Sometimes that's exactly the wrong move. Many symptoms associated with underwatering can also appear when roots spend too much time in overly wet conditions. That's why diagnosis matters. This is one reason experienced gardeners sometimes reach for hydrogen peroxide long before they reach for more water. Not because peroxide replaces proper watering, but because it can help reveal a hidden possibility many gardeners never consider. The plant may not be asking for more moisture at all. It may be struggling because excess moisture has already changed the root environment. That's an important distinction. Most gardeners see stress and think, add water. Experienced gardeners see stress and ask, what changed underneath the soil? Hydrogen peroxide often enters that investigation because of what it may reveal about root zone conditions. Before reaching for the watering can, ask what the plant is actually telling you. More water is not always more care. The gardeners who avoid repeated losses are often the ones who learn to pause, observe, and diagnose before reacting. That single habit can prevent countless avoidable problems, and nowhere does that lesson become more obvious than in containers. Number 3. The container garden. Secret container gardening creates advantages. It also creates risks. Everything happens faster. Soil dries faster. Nutrients change faster. And mistakes can become visible much sooner than they do in the ground. What many gardeners don't realize is that containers also concentrate hidden root zone conditions. A drainage issue affecting one section of a garden bed may affect an entire container. A watering mistake that would be minor in the landscape can become significant in a pot. One reason hydrogen peroxide appears so often in container gardening conversations is that container problems tend to reveal themselves faster. Small drainage issues become larger. Small watering mistakes become larger. Small root problems become larger. That makes hydrogen peroxide particularly interesting in containers because gardeners can often observe its effects more quickly than they would in a large garden bed. Experienced container gardeners understand this advantage. They know that a confined growing environment exposes hidden root zone problems much sooner, and that makes containers one of the easiest places to discover what hydrogen peroxide is actually doing. Successful container gardeners rarely treat their plants exactly the same way they treat in-ground gardens. They adjust their decisions to fit the environment. And that idea leads directly to one of the biggest misunderstandings surrounding hydrogen peroxide itself. This is probably the right moment for an important reminder. Hydrogen peroxide is not a substitute for good gardening practices. It cannot compensate for poor drainage. It cannot permanently solve chronic overwatering. It cannot replace healthy soil structure. And it cannot eliminate every disease problem that appears in a garden. That's actually what makes it valuable. The gardeners who get the most from hydrogen peroxide are usually not the ones looking for a miracle. They're the ones using it as part of a larger prevention strategy. They understand that timing often matters more than treatment. And that brings us to one of the most overlooked opportunities in gardening. Number 2. The disease prevention window. Most gardeners miss. Most gardeners respond after a problem becomes visible. That's normal. Visible symptoms demand attention. The challenge is that many plant problems begin long before symptoms appear. By the time leaves show damage, options may already be more limited. By the time growth slows, stress may already be established. Experienced gardeners often look for earlier clues. Changes in moisture, environmental shifts, early warning signs, subtle indicators that something is moving in the wrong direction. One thing many newer gardeners miss is that experienced gardeners often start paying attention when conditions begin changing, not when symptoms finally appear. That's one reason hydrogen peroxide sometimes becomes part of their toolkit earlier than most people expect. They're not necessarily reacting to damage, they're reacting to risk. Hydrogen peroxide sometimes becomes useful during this stage because it is often part of preventive action rather than emergency response. The decision shift here is simple but powerful. Don't wait for obvious damage before evaluating risk. The earlier a problem is recognized, the easier it often becomes to manage. And that leads to the most important discovery in this entire countdown. Number 1. Why experienced gardeners watch the roots before they watch the leaves. This may be the most overlooked hydrogen peroxide advantage in the entire garden. Most gardeners use hydrogen peroxide after they notice a problem. Experienced gardeners often pay attention to what peroxide reveals before the problem becomes obvious. That's because many plant issues begin underground. Roots lose vigor, soil conditions change, moisture imbalances develop, disease pressure starts building, and all of it happens before leaves tell the story. Hydrogen peroxide keeps appearing in experienced gardeners' toolkits for one simple reason. It interacts with some of the earliest stages of those hidden processes. That's the capability most people never think about. Not seed starting, not fungus, not root rot. The ability to notice and respond earlier. And when you look back at every item in this countdown, a pattern becomes obvious. Hydrogen peroxide isn't valuable because it does one extraordinary thing. It's valuable because it can play a role in several of the hidden processes we've covered throughout this countdown. Root oxygen, seed preparation, surface sanitation, disease pressure, early root zone investigation, That's the capability many gardeners underestimate. Most people see a simple household product. Experienced gardeners often see a tool that may help them respond earlier to conditions that would otherwise stay hidden much longer. And that's why hydrogen peroxide continues showing up in so many different corners of the garden. So how should you actually think about hydrogen peroxide going forward? A simple framework can help. When you encounter a garden problem, start with the cause rather than the symptom. Ask yourself, is this a moisture issue, a root issue, a sanitation issue, a disease pressure issue, or simply a maintenance issue that's been ignored for too long? Then ask a second question, either. Would hydrogen peroxide help address one of those underlying conditions, or am I looking for it to solve a problem it was never designed to solve? That's an important distinction. If drainage is poor, fix drainage. If watering habits are creating stress, correct watering habits. If sanitation is lacking, improve sanitation. Hydrogen peroxide may support those efforts in some situations, but it should not replace them. The smartest gardeners rarely ask, should I use peroxide? They ask, what is actually happening here? And once they understand that answer, the right response usually becomes much easier to see. At first glance, hydrogen peroxide looks like one of the simplest products in gardening. A cheap bottle sitting on a shelf, easy to overlook. But as you've seen throughout this countdown, its real value isn't tied to a single use. It's tied to awareness, the ability to recognize hidden conditions before they become visible problems, the ability to think about roots before plants decline, to think about prevention before disease spreads, to think about causes before symptoms. That's the decision advantage many gardeners never fully appreciate. Many experienced gardeners aren't necessarily using more products than everyone else. They're often making better decisions because they recognize hidden conditions sooner. And that's the real advantage behind many of the hydrogen peroxide secrets we've covered today.